Good evening and welcome back to the Savvy Street Show. We today have a roundtable on flourishing and we have a panel of experts. First up is my regular co-host who's come back as a guest, Roger Bissell, musician, writer, and philosopher. And Roger will introduce our first distinguished guest and then I'll introduce the second one. Welcome to the show, Roger.
Thank you, Vinay. Good to be here. Um, Edward Younkins is professor of accountancy and business at Wheeling University, and that's in Wheeling, West Virginia. And he is the executive director of its Institute for the Study of Capitalism and Morality. He has written a trilogy of books on freedom and flourishing, and they are Capitalism and Commerce, Champions of a Free Society, and Flourishing and Happiness in a Free Society. Welcome to the show, Ed.
Thank you. Really happy to be here.
Okay, our second guest is Winton Bates. Winton Bates is an Australian breakdancer. Oh, my apologies. Sorry.
That's the
My
kangaroo.
apologies. Economist.
There, much better.
His economic policy career gave him good reasons to become a strong advocate of free markets and led to the interest in broader issues related to liberty and human flourishing. Winton is the author of Freedom, Progress, and Human Flourishing, published by Hamilton Books in 2021. Welcome to the show, Winton.
Thank you, Vinay. Thank you, Vinay. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about my book.
Okay, so first question actually does relate to the book. Can you briefly describe the gist of your book on flourishing? And after you, we will go to Ed and Roger.
Thank you, Vinay. Well, here is the 4-minute version. As the title suggests, my book is about freedom, progress, and human flourishing. The concept of human flourishing is central to the book. In the introductory chapter, I draw on the ancient wisdom of Aristotle and some modern writers in discussing the basic goods that a flourishing human could be expected to have. I argue that self-direction is of fundamental importance to human flourishing because our nature as humans gives us the potential to exercise practical wisdom to direct our own flourishing. Wise and well-informed self-direction helps us to stay healthy in mind and body, to have positive relationships with others, to live in harmony with nature, and to do many of the things that we aspire to do. So that is where freedom comes into the picture. Liberty provides the context in which individuals can exercise self-direction. It enables individuals to flourish in different ways in accordance with their values, provided they do not interfere with the rights of others. I follow the lead of Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Deneau in viewing natural rights as metanormative principles, establishing the political legal conditions under which self-directed flourishing can take place. Well, progress, as I define it, is the growth of opportunities for human flourishing. Now, that is one of the few original ideas that is in the book. I think it is useful to view progress in that way because it puts the onus on everyone who has a view about what progress means. It puts the onus on them to show that their view is consistent with widespread growth of opportunities for people to flourish. For example, the onus would be on those who want to argue for redistribution of wealth and argue that that is part of progress, to show that that is consistent with widespread growth of opportunities for human flourishing. Technological advances and productivity growth have been of central importance to the massive growth of opportunities for human flourishing over the last 200 years. I'm optimistic about the continuation of progress over the longer term, but I'm not particularly optimistic about the next decade or so. Whatever happens, however, it is important to keep in mind that the national economic and social context is only one part of the story of human flourishing. A substantial part of my book is devoted to considering what individuals can do to help themselves, irrespective of the national economic and social context in which they live. At the individual level, the extent to which each of us can flourish is determined to a large extent, by our capacities for wise and well-informed self-direction. Self-direction poses a challenge for everyone, but each individual has inside knowledge of their own values and aspirations. So that makes it unlikely that any government agency could manage any aspect of their lives as well as they can do themselves, with the help of family and friends and professional help when they need it. So, sum up, people need the freedom to flourish. And that.
Thank you. Ed,
Yes.
we did have to describe your trilogy in a little summation.
I'm just going to focus on the third book,
Okay.
because it's the one technically right on flourishing and happiness in a free society. So my inquiry in that book doesn't extend beyond a systematic level. I'm outlining the essentials of a worldview. I'm leaving it to the smart guys, you philosophers and economists, to fill the details and to critique what I've done and to extend it. Essentially, to survive and flourish, a person, a man, a woman, must recognize that nature, as you all know, has its own imperatives. Must recognize that there's a natural law that derives from the nature of man and the world, and we can discover that through reason. That's one of the things I started with. A world of objective reality exists. There's a human nature, and man's nature, as we know, is to be individual, volitionally conscious, rational, and purposeful. And in the book, I talk about the goal or function of an individual human being is to perfect himself by fulfilling his potentialities that make him who he is. For me, for you, for everybody, flourishing is a successful state of life. And the way I look at it, happiness is a positive state of consciousness that flows from or maybe accompanies a flourishing life. And as the four of us know, rationality, reason, is the foundational means to the end of human flourishing. And we also talk, and I know you all did too, about practical wisdom, which really I think is an aspect of rationality, and I believe you all do too. Involves the ability to discern the relevant and important aspects of one's circumstances in order to make the most proper response to them. Very important, as Winton pointed out, and you guys do too, natural rights are based on the common attributes of human beings and therefore apply universally to all people and to all actions. As discussed, as Winton pointed out, by Rasmussen and Denial, a metanormative system of negative rights that provide the context of self-directedness is what we're talking about. So it's at the metanormative level. You have to have that first, and then you have the normative level, the individual level of morality after that. So we need a political and legal order that protects these natural rights. That's a necessary precondition for individual self-direction and for the possibility, as we know, that human flourishing can take place in a social context. As I mentioned a little while ago, a flourishing life, including the happiness that either follows from or accompanies it, is a person's ultimate value. So we have to have values. To survive, to flourish, to be happy, a person must select values, place them in some kind of hierarchy, and then strive to attain them. That involves goals, because human beings are goal directed. And in a way, the way I go in my book, again, kind of a systemic level, not real specific, the goals are simply specific forms of values. The values provide a strategic underpinning for your goal setting activities. There are a number of, in the book, I talk about a number of general goods and virtues that provide structure to this whole process. We have generic goods like knowledge and health, friendships, that need to be integrated in various measures depending on your circumstances. Virtues also need to be incorporated. Virtues are kind of like principles of action that promote the flourishing of individual. Now, myself, in my book, I pick and choose. I think if these things reflect reality, why not pick and choose what you're talking about in your book? I'm not a philosopher. I'm not exactly an economist. Maybe I have one degree there. I'm not an accounting guy, you know. But Ayn Rand, to me, makes a powerful case of the rational pursuit of 7 virtues and consistently practicing them. Rationality, the main one. And then after that, honesty, independence, justice, integrity, productiveness, and pride. Of course, she saw rationality as the master virtue. I also talk about the importance of being in a state of flow when one is engaged in meaningful, self-controlled, and goal-related activities. If you're in a state of flow, or in a focused immersion in some activity, you lack self-consciousness, you're just doing it, and the merging of awareness and action all take place at once. Also important in my overall model, what do you want to call it, self-esteem, relates to a person's legitimate attitude of self-affirmation. I mean, you really deserve it. Self-esteem is connected to a sense of agency and control of one's environment. Now, kind of as an aside, it isn't really essential to the flourishing part, but one thing in the book, I do talk about how, because a lot of people, Austrian economists, objectivists, they 2 different areas, and I kind of try to make a case where they're compatible. The Austrian economists talk about values being subjective, and clearly objectivists say they're objective. And I say these claims can be compatible because they are not claims about the same phenomena. They are complementary and compatible. The Austrians view actions from the perspective of a neutral examiner. In other words, you have goals? Okay, I'll let you know if your means achieve those goals. They don't make a value judgment. But importantly, the objectivist view of moral values, living a good life, flourishing, happiness, all that kind of stuff, implement that. Because they're talking about making decisions that help you flourish as a human being, as a moral agent himself. So again, I think those 2 areas can work together. It doesn't really fit in with my notion of flourishing so much, but I threw it in the book. Why? Because I could. I just did it. Last thing, personal flourishing requires a life with other people. Sociality, you need that. Benefaction, charity, can be viewed as an expression and a specific manifestation of one's capacity for social cooperation. That's it.
I have no idea what it is. Oh, sorry. That's our book. Go for it, Roger.
Well, sure. Vinay and I wrote this book, Modernizing Aristotle's Ethics. And we wanted to update Aristotle's ethics by folding in or integrating with it some of the best ideas in science and philosophy that have come along since ancient Greece. And this includes the work of psychologists like Maslow and Frankl, philosophers like Aquinas, Ayn Rand, and some of our own colleagues, Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Denial, known as the Dougs, and Chris Gabbara. Um, I don't have a lot to say about this because I kind of wanted to save going into detail on our view of flourishing, certainly my view. But I should say this about the structure of the book. We wrote the front part of it and the back part of it together. And then in between that, we each had two chapters that we alternated, and I gave some history of philosophy. And then Vinay talked about some psychological and neurological and types of issues. And then I went into more, I guess you'd call it the nature of human being and what natural law principles, I think is what Ed Winton referred to them as. And then Vinay talked about ethics, actually, like principles of humaneness and meaningfulness and self-actualization. And then we've rounded it out by talking some about Aristotle's politics and how it would apply to the present day, or how it might be modified to the present day. Vinay, did you want to add anything to what I've said?
No, not particularly at this point in time. I'll see it towards the end. So I will actually go on to the next question, which is about flourishing. Can
Oh,
do
I
you
think
in your
it's
book define or describe what a flourishing state is, and if so, how?
Perfect, because I'm a lot shorter on this one. Personal flourishing, human flourishing, self-actualization, that kind of anticipates another question coming up. I call all these things the same. Moral well-being, I kind of equivocate on that. But to me, it involves the rational use of one's individual human potentialities, including talents, abilities, and virtues, in the pursuit of a person's freely and rationally chosen values and goals. It's not an abstraction. It's highly personal, agent relative, we could say, by nature. Consists in the fulfillment of a man's human nature and unique potentialities. It's concerned with choices and actions that deal with the particular and the contingent. One person's self-actualization is not the same as another's. What is called for in terms of concrete actions such as choice of career, education, friends, home, varies from person to person. Personal flourishing becomes an actuality when one uses his practical reason to consider his unique needs, circumstances, capacities, and so on, to determine which concrete instantiations of human values, virtues, and goods will comprise his well-being. The idea of flourishing is inclusive and can encompass a wide variety of constitutive ends such as knowledge, development of character traits, productive work, religious pursuits, community building, charitable activities, allegiance to persons and causes, self-efficacy, material well-being, pleasurable sensations, and so on. And that brings me to a conclusion of how I basically describe flourishing. Thank you.
Okay, good. Roger?
very good. In the broader sense, flourishing is what is not just surviving, but living well. And this sounds probably a lot like what Ed said when he started out, actualizing one's human potentialities and one's individual talents and skills and knowledge in the service of one's deepest human needs. The problem, though, is that about 30 years ago, there was a big debate over survival versus flourishing. And I think it was often discussed kind of narrowly as being focused on one's own personal context of living, merely living versus living well, one's own personal context. And about 25 years ago, give or take, it occurred to me that what Aristotle and Aquinas had said about this could be very helpful. They identified three key factors in all successful life: nutrition, growth, and generativity.
Mm.
Nutrition and growth were essentially inside yourself, while generativity was something that was outside yourself. Sometimes they just focused on reproduction, like having children and so on, or like a tree would have fruit and the like. But as we know, humans do a lot more than sometimes they don't even have children. They certainly don't have apples and pears hanging from their arms. uh, uh, anyway, I called this the Aristotelian tripod, and I thought I'd really come up with a cool idea there. And as Ed knows, I had this on my website for a while, and then I thought I want to write about this, so I better detach it so that when people go to my website, they don't see a link to this weird sounding article, the Aristotelian tripod,
I
and
found it.
but Ed did a search for it on Google, and he found it anyway. He found
Yeah.
it because it was still posted. It just
was
wasn't
excellent. It's excellent.
linked from my website, but it was there. So good for you, Ed. You're very intrepid, good searcher,
Thank you.
hunter gatherer.
Yeah,
I
Ed,
later, yeah, I later realized that there was also a time element, legacy, that one leaves behind after one's career is over or after one's life, and you will be preparing your legacy as you have your sense of mortality and of the future and what you're going to leave behind to children or colleagues or students or the world, etc. So we've got genetic legacy, which is children and close relatives, and then we got non-genetic legacy, which is did you grow a good garden? Did you build a skyscraper? Did you write a novel or a symphony? Anything, or did you produce learned students as a teacher, etc.? All these ways are leaving behind, not just generating and creating things, but leaving something behind. So these fit nicely within the personal and the social levels of Chris Gabar's model. He had a three-level model. He had the personal, which I took to be the surviving and thriving, in other words, growing, nutrition and growth. And then in the social level, there was the generativity and the legacy. And then, if you're going to live the fullest life and flourish in the broadest sense, not just thriving and generating and all that, but also you have to act within certain institutions, such as the economy and such as the political structure. The polity is what we call it in our book. And all of this material I discuss in chapter 4 of the book. And so in a broader sense, flourishing includes growth, thriving, generativity, legacy, economy, and polity. So I guess I kind of gave two answers to what we mean by flourishing. So it's the thriving or all of the above, sort of.
yeah, we actually, in the other thing that happened in our book, we did define flourishing as a mental state as well. So it is both. And the mental state definition that I came up with was a default state of serenity, punctuated by self inflicted or unexpected pleasures. And, the word self inflicted is often used, self inflicted in harm, self inflicted harm. But if you deliberately, like Winton, decide to have a walk around Lake Macquarie, it's a self inflicted kind of
Oh
pleasure.
no.
Yeah, you have fun doing it, or you listen to music, or you play music like Roger, or
Yeah.
yeah. And those pleasures can be of recreation, such as wine, music, laughter, food, camaraderie, as well as those arising from practicing your competencies. So, for instance, if you're very good at golf and you enjoy playing golf, you go on the golf course, play golf. That's a kind of a self-inflicted pleasure. And undergirded is the last part of the definition by resilience. So that's how we kind of describe a flourishing state, because you can get a great mental state by taking drugs, but that worsens your default state of serenity. So when you come back from the pleasure, if you are flourishing, you must come back to a default state of everything's fine. Fine with the world. Default state of serenity. Hey, time to move on to some practical stuff. Oh,
Winton.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Winton's definition.
My definition is very short. I would like to say to start with that I agree with everything that everyone else has said. And I think my definition would be consistent with that. Okay, I spent about 3 or 4 pages before I come to that definition in the book. But my definition of flourishing combines definitions by Nira Badwa and Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Den Isle. I think I've got that pronunciation right now. Human flourishing is the exercise of practical wisdom with integrity in the pursuit and achievement of happiness in an objectively worthwhile life. So I'll hand back to Vinay.
Thank you, Winton. Apologies for skipping. The Kangaroos was in the Olympics too. Now, this coming to the practical side, if we
Yes.
were asked for advice by a healthy, otherwise physically healthy teenager who feels melancholic frequently, what would it be, and would our advice change if it was an adult? So we go to Roger first.
Thanks, Vinay. Assuming that this frequent melancholy is psychological, in other words, it's value issues, frustrations, that kind of thing, and not some sort of physically based depression, I would say to this teenager, young man or young lady, figure out what you really, really want to do and find a way to make it happen. Of course, there's a lot to be unpacked there, but that is the essence of what I would tell them. And you might not know right away, but keep looking, keep seeking, searching. The best place I've seen this laid out in a practical way, a nice program actually. There are various books that have been written by a guy named Brian Tracy on values clarification and goal setting, going after what you really want in life, figuring out what you really want in life. As Vinay says in chapter 5 of our book, a person needs a central meaning and purpose in their life, a mission, he calls it. And I'm on board with that. As Ayn Rand had Dagny Taggart realize in Atlas Shrugged, you need to internalize the message, don't let it go. If you have a central meaning and purpose to your life, and it seems like, I don't know how I'm going to achieve this, but I really want it, then figure it out and don't give up on it. And this is the same advice I would give to a teenager, to an adult, even to a seasoned citizen like myself. We can't all become world famous painters in our 80s like Grandma Moses, but I don't think we should shut off our minds and our ambition in either our 20s or our 40s or our 60s. And I do have a little more practical advice, which goes along with this. If you really crank up a mission and you're really working hard at it, and it doesn't completely make your blues go away, then maybe there's just something else missing in your life. It may not be the career purpose or whatever. It may be something else, like maybe your health or maybe your social, that part of the pie. I like pie diagrams. I think they're really great for visualizing. It may be you are feeling a lack of personal connection or loneliness, in which case you should try to find a way to reach out and form some new friendships. And my advice on that is not to be too exclusionary on what philosophy or politics or religion they have. In my own life, I have people across the map, or across several maps, I should say. There are lots of other people out there who may be lonely too and would be happy to be your friend if you took the initiative to seek them out. That's especially important, I would say, again, for older people. one of the key elements in aging well is social connection, not being isolated. A sense of isolation is really tough to deal with. If you feel cut off or alienated, even for a brief time, it's kind of hard to handle. And I know some people, some of my older relatives have gone through that, and I try to visit them and reach out, and I know they had friends, but that's something to take. It's just that having a worthwhile goal or purpose in life, as Winton said, is very, very important. But also having that social connection. We're not just rational, purposive beings, we're also social beings. And I think that needs to be always kept clear, that we're doing something good for ourselves in regard to our relationships to other people, and not just letting those things be neglected or to drift. Be proactive about that, like you are for your career.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. One of the illustrations we had for a teenager was Greta Thunberg, and while we don't like what she's doing, she was extremely depressed when she turned to green agenda, and that made her enormously enthusiastic. Her depression dropped. So we do ask that you check your mission objectively as well, which she hasn't done, but because there could be a day of reckoning and an epiphany that you've been doing the wrong thing the last 40, 50 years, and that could lead to future problems. But if you check that, that's the number one thing, mission. And we also ask that you be humane at all times, or try to be humane at all times across the four orders of humaneness, and self-actualize, which we then define as pursuing your mission, as well as we have allocated 7 humane virtues to be, 7 humane faculties rather, to be improved, and we can never become absolutely perfect at all 7. Over to you, Winton. What's your advice?
Well, yes, I think my advice is very similar to that suggested by Roger and yourself. If a person tells me that they feel melancholic frequently, I'd be suggesting that they may need some professional help. I'd be more specific about the kind of professional help that they should seek if the previous discussion indicated that they no longer get any pleasure out of the things that once gave them pleasure. In that instance, I would suggest a psychologist with training in acceptance and commitment therapy. That's a therapy developed by Stephen Hayes, ACT. So they might have to wait for a while to see a trained professional. But in the meantime, I'd suggest that they read this book. It's an easy-to-read book by Russ Harris, and it's entitled The Happiness Trap. Now, that book was suggested to me by a clinical psychologist friend who was, this was about over a decade ago. They were trying to persuade me that my view of happiness needed to be had more depth to it. I sort of had the smiley face type view of happiness, frame of mind type view, which is quite valid, but I needed to go into more depth. Now, the happiness trap is a trap, and it's about trying to find happiness by avoiding or trying to get rid of negative feelings. That's a trap, because the harder we try to get rid of negative feelings, then the more negative feelings we tend to create. So if a young person might get into a happiness trap by attempting to use social media to lift their spirits whenever they feel sad or lonely. An older person might get into a happiness trap by getting into the habit of trying to wipe the slate clean after a hard day at the office by using alcohol or drugs. Now, the thing about ACT is that it encourages people to identify and endorse the values that will help them to cope with these unpleasant thoughts and unpleasant feelings, and to set sensible goals and to act purposefully in pursuit of them. So I think there's a lot of common ground there between what I'm saying and what Roger was saying in particular.
Ed, you have a answer to that?
I would pretty much agree with what all three of you are saying, but just to add a little bit, I'd probably start off with asking the teenager uh, how often how long they're feeling melancholy, what might be the circumstances. Then maybe I would say, well, when's the last time you felt happy? What makes you happy? Um, to get them to talk about what, try to switch them over to thinking about their lives, as Winton was saying, about what positively, going into that direction. And only one thing I'll add too is with respect to if it's an adult, probably pretty much the same thing. But along with what the three of you said, I would probably perhaps delve a little more into meaning, purpose in their lives. Being an adult that is more in the pursuit of their flourishing, and that's about it. But I think you guys did a great job in outlining this.
Thank you. Well, we're moving on to self actualization and whether we distinguish between flourishing and self actualization and which one is more fundamental. I'll start with my answer to that is yes, we do distinguish between those two, and we particularly and strongly distinguish between self actualization and happiness. And which is more fundamental is self actualization. That's part of having the mission, pursuit of rational faculties in terms of improving those rational faculties and being humane. We see that activity as self actualization, and in the process of self actualizing, is what happens. Happiness is it's like an exhaust or an epiphenomenon. It just simply happens. And if it doesn't happen, so be it. It will happen now and then, and maybe you won't feel so blue now every day, but you might feel blue or frustrated occasionally because you are dealing with society, you are dealing with uncertain outcomes. And we quote a number of philosophers from Bertrand Russell to John Stuart Mill to dramatist George Bernard Shaw, who all made the same observation. If you're committed to something, stay committed. Do not pursue happiness as its own goal. And same thing I could say about flourishing. You can't pursue flourishing. It's just got to happen on the side as you pursue what can be objectively pursued. Winton.
Yeah, okay. I think there's a definitional issue involved. I view flourishing as being the encompassing thing, that eudaimonia, or can't pronounce that word, but that flourishing is what it's all about. That's our purpose in life, and and individual flourishing involves flourishing for an individual involves self-actualization. So that's a means, I say, to flourish. I've been using the term self-actualization when discussing Abraham Maslow's theory for obvious reasons. And but Maslow uses the term specifically to refer to the process of realization of potential. And that's all I've got to say about that one.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
Yes, as I said earlier, I do not distinguish between flourishing and self-actualization. For the last 30, 35 years, I've talked about personal flourishing, human flourishing, self-actualization, moral well-being, and I kind of treat them as the same. So a little bit different from Winton there. And that's about it for me on that.
Okay, Roger, you'd like to add something?
Oh, I sure would. Again, I'm in my own writing in our book, I treat the terms as basically equivalent. The only distinction I make is kind of a grammatical one, which I'll mention or explain in a moment. David Norton wrote an amazing book about 50 years ago called Personal Destinies, and he talked all about this issue. And late in the book, he talked about two aspects of eudaimonia or happiness. or I guess flourishing. And he said that one was a state of being, like what point have you reached? What condition are you in? And then the other one was the emotional or psychological feeling that accompanies that state of being. So I think Rand talks about that too. She talks about happiness is the state of having achieved your values, but it's also a state of non-contradictory joy. So she talks about it as a condition and as a feeling, and they're really together. Okay, I did say something about the grammar of it, and it's all of it has to do with the same phenomenon. It's a living organism is functioning very well, sustaining its life and developing its powers and abilities and pursuing its goals. If we unpack this a bit, we can see that flourishing refers to an ongoing process of living well. And that process is carried out by an individual creature. So the self as in self-actualization is implicit in the term flourishing. On the other hand, the term self-actualization refers to the end result of the process, an individual self being in the state of having lived well implies a process that has been carried out. So if we use the term self-actualizing, then we are talking about the very same ongoing process as flourishing. We don't have a similar term for the end result. It would be an awful sounding term like flourishization. I think I had that when I went to
There
the
you
dentist
go.
last week and I got some flourishization for my teeth.
That's more
It's,
complicated than eudaimonia.
Yeah.
I know it
Yeah.
sounds like you're speaking with a mouthful of marbles.
Yeah.
So another concept we could use in talking both about the process and the result is self-perfection. You are self-perfecting, self-actualizing, flourishing, whether you're striving for it or you have achieved it. So it's like you're on a trip. There's the process or the journey, and then there's the destination. There's the end result, and they're both covered by the same term. So when you have TION on the end, you have to ask yourself, am I talking about a process of self-actualization or the result of self-actualization? But again, that's just grammar, really. It's grammar, and the whole thing has to do with well functioning, developing your powers and abilities.
Okay. I'm going to jump to the next question and combine it with something else. Like all four of us are either in the United States or Australia, and neither country is in a great state right now. With all sorts of things that we don't approve of happening around us, the cancellations, the excess debt, the cost of living going up, and particularly on the psychological side for young people or also older people. And I was going to mention ignorance can be bliss sometimes. Like Greta Thunberg is not aware that this climate emergency, climate alarmism is a scam or a fraud or at least not scientifically valid, and that helps her. But unfortunately, all four of us are well aware of a raft of things that make us kind of outcast in the kind of woke Marxist culture. So, first up, Winton, is it possible now to stick to our real beliefs and still flourish in Australia, say?
Yeah, well, I'll start with the more general question of whether it is possible for people to flourish in the US and Australia. And in my view, it is still possible, although, of course, people could flourish to a greater extent if they had more economic freedom and more liberty in general. The US and Australia still offer much better opportunities for human flourishing than most other countries. That the fact that large numbers of people from other countries want to migrate to the US and Australia for economic reasons and social reasons to leave war-torn countries, for example. I think that attests to the fact that there are relatively more opportunities available in Australia and the US than in other countries still. Okay, the second part was, is it possible to stick to your beliefs and succeed commercially in the US and Australia? Well, I think commercial success is still largely about selling a product that other people want to buy. However, you've got all the government distortions in the economy affecting what other people are willing to buy. So, for example, someone's selling a service commercially, and then the government comes in and decides to offer a service free of charge, or changes regulations in a way that makes it unprofitable. This is essentially happening in the green technology area in Australia, and I guess the other areas as well. But I'm interested in what other people have to say about that question.
Okay, Ed?
Yeah, I want to focus on the part about succeeding commercially, especially with respect to entrepreneurs. Okay, a lot of obstacles to entrepreneurs. The government, of course, that's the greatest enemy of an entrepreneur. Regulation, paperwork, taxes, interest rates, high interest rates, occupational licensing. You get the idea. And again, it's going to be tough to do that.
Right.
But essentially, though, a successful entrepreneur has the right attitude, knows that knowledge and opportunities are there if you work at it long enough, hard enough. The opportunities are constantly changing. They're local, highly individualized. And the wealth creator, if really focused and dedicated to this, doesn't experience, can experience luck and serendipity, but doesn't rely on those things.
Right.
Profits, losses are not totally the result of random processes. People choose their projects. So use your rationality, use your reason, observe, ask questions, look for patterns, make novel connections people haven't seen before, imagine possibilities, project the future. So that's what I'm saying. A motivated person, their actions are motivated from within. An inspired individual may seek to attain his or her goals and values, the better conditions of his life, to accomplish something, the legacy thing that that Roger was talking about. And again, I'll end with this last little bit: a wealth creator, and you can do that. I still think in the United States or Australia, it tends to be a person of has ability, of course, but pursues his or her goals relentlessly in the face of obstacles and oppositions and setbacks, failures. To be a self-driven doer, one must expend both mental and physical effort, persist in the face of adversity, confront the unknown, face challenges, learn from failure, but have confidence in your capacity to deal with the world. And again, rationality. Again, take rational steps in pursuing your goals. And I'll end with this. The successful entrepreneur tends to be, there's a lot of adjectives here, but this is true, visionary, confident, independent, action-oriented, passionate, confident, and virtuous. Important part there. Who uses reason to focus his enthusiasm in his efforts to attain his goals. And I'll just end with that. So, yes, I do think it's still possible.
Roger?
Yeah, just a brief clarification. Vinay,
Yeah.
you mentioned that ignorance is bliss. Is that something we're going to maybe circle back to if we have time? Otherwise, I'll just try to fold that into what I say here.
Yeah,
We won't have time, so just
Okay.
fold that in. Yeah.
Okay. Is it possible to flourish in the U.S. or Australia today? I'm going to kind of step back a ways. I liked all of what you two guys have said already. It's a lot of practical and character-oriented concerns. And I think of those issues. My answer is it's possible to flourish, but it's by no means guaranteed. But then welcome to human life, right? Some people do flourish, though rarely in the current setup without some kind of government involvement, I'll say assistance or favors or whatever. It's really hard. It's really hard to find a niche to work in. You have to be very unusual. Very few people with our specific beliefs who have risen to the top and become multimillionaires, let alone the billionaires, are extremely popular in sports or entertainment or the literary world. I mean, how many we could say how many objectivists are really sitting on top of the world, like Taylor Swift, for instance, or like Elon Musk. I would distinguish also, and I appreciate all of Ed's comments about commercial success, that issue. But to me, to flourish, if we can broaden our uh, our thoughts about it, all you have to do all you have to do is self-actualize and become the best that you can be in whatever area you are working. And given the circumstances, given that it's very context driven or context relevant here, and it's all on a continuum. It's not an all or nothing thing. If you can't self-actualize or flourish at all, then you're going to wither and die. So we're leaving that aside. But even if you're thwarted to quite an extent by government restrictions, or you're in a culture that's kind of wilting away or rotting, and it doesn't appreciate what you do, you can still find a way to create and produce what you most want to. You'll have to adapt to the conditions and scale your ambition to what's possible given the culture, the market, the level of government interference. But you don't have to be Howard Rourke or Dagny Taggart in order to flourish. You just have to be like them in your character. You have to be rational, productive, morally ambitious. In other words, you have to want to be better and better. You have to have a deep sense of purpose and mission, and you have to have a humane relationship to yourself and others. Don't beat up on others, and don't beat up on yourself. Don't cheat others or lie to others. Don't lie to yourself. If you have these character traits and psychological traits, you will flourish regardless of your level of market success and financial wealth and fame. And that, in my opinion, is what life should be all about. Now, I do know that there are some people who just don't have the very deep level of abstract philosophical knowledge about life in the world that the four of us have. I mean, we're on the pinnacle, right? But
Of course
but
we are.
but it's possible for partial ignorance. I'm not. I'm trying to keep a sense of humor. I'm not mocking us. I think we're all fine fellows. Okay. There are people throughout history that have had more or less happy lives without being philosophers and with only flawed guidelines that they've gotten from their family or their church or their community. So, but even a fully rational philosophy, and it's worked out and systematized, that doesn't guarantee bliss. And a less rational philosophy is no guarantee that you're going to be miserable. Most people's lives and levels of bliss or pleasure or serene enjoyment are mixed, either because their philosophies are mixed or their practice of their philosophy is mixed. Like Hank and Dagny, back to my two favorite characters in Atlas Shrugged. They had some bliss together for a while, at least we can imagine, despite gaps in their ethical knowledge, but they were both hampered and they were both compromised to the extent they didn't fully understand the issues they were fighting against in the culture, the philosophical and psychological issues, and they had not yet uncovered all the false ideas that they had accepted and internalized. So it's ironic and sad that they both eventually did get this full understanding of life and morality, but only Dagny got to graduate to this higher level of bliss, and Hank presumably was left in the cold because of that high male to female ratio in Galt's Gulch, right? I mean,
Yeah.
what's a guy to do, you know?
Yeah.
What Roger's saying reminds me of one other Ayn Rand quote, which isn't about the pyramid of ability, but it's about the pyramid of resilience. And I think she doesn't exactly call it resilience, but moral endurance. And you have to have enormous amount of moral endurance if you're trapped in a mission that is looked down upon by the society as is at the moment. So if your mission was create great music, the music that you like, and if you create it and the cancer culture doesn't get to you because of your lyrics, you might become enormously successful, and at least make a living at music or a lot more. But if you are in one of these intellectual spheres like climate change, like a scientist who's a geologist, or a public intellectual who's getting cancelled everywhere, then we have a lot more trouble. And I want to take just three quick examples. One was, of course, Greta Thunberg, where ignorance was bliss. But now take the other extreme, the brightest of the brightest best. It's not one of the four of us, it's Aristotle.
Yes.
And Aristotle was in exile for part of his life. Take John Locke. He was also in exile, or being hidden in the Earl of Shaftesbury's house for part of his life. Spinoza was in house arrest.
Yep.
Galileo was arrested. And last but not the least, I'm going to take the example of Murray Rothbard. When Hoppy found him, I think it was in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and very early 90s only, because he passed away early. He was teaching at a polytechnic, and he didn't even have an office of his own. He was on a desk along with other assistants, and Hoppy was shocked. It was only later on in his life he got a bit of a pay rise with University of Nevada at Las Vegas, and he had his own office. But would we say Rothbard flourished? Absolutely. He stuck to his guns. He stuck to what he believed in, and we don't necessarily agree with everything he said. But that was a life, kind of, to me, like Howard Roark, in a literal sense. That's all I have to say. We have just enough time for one last quick question with quick answers. We've all got this theory on flourishing, and our Aristotle book got uh, placed in both psychology and philosophy. And we start with Ed. Where does all this theory sit?
I can tell you. Human flourishing, the way I see it, ought to be the overall aim of education. Um, human
Interesting
flourishing
answer.
gained some respect there, but it rightly gains popularity as the overarching ideal of education. I mean, think about it. It has implications for education, upbringing of children. Teachers and parents need to know what constitutes a flourishing life. Okay, and then what contributes to it and what does not, and communicate that to the kids. And they're expected to act in a way that enables the children, to lead a flourishing life in the future. And what's going to end up with this? Not very much, but it's true. Um, Human flourishing and education are intertwined. They're mutually reinforcing. Education enables flourishing. And the more you flourish, the more you want to be educated. So there's kind of I call it a spiral of flourishing and education. Education enables flourishing. In turn, flourishing enhances education, and you keep going. So I think that we ought to build the schools around the concept of flourishing. And I'll leave it at that, and you can take over. Okay?
Roger.
Yeah, well, theoretical versus applied flourishing, I would agree with Ed. The most crucial area for applied flourishing to be offered in bookstores and in schools is, education, obviously, in schools. Also, for employee relations, family relations, husband-wife relations, all of this needs to be drilled into counselors, and there need to be popular books available for, and there are, but they don't say here's a book on flourishing to help make your marriage better. But
Yeah.
maybe they should. Now, for theory, see, I was going to answer in terms of theory, and I think that what Vinay said was exactly right on. I think philosophy and psychology are where the topic of flourishing belongs. If I were saying I want to find out what Aristotle said about flourishing, I would go to the philosophy section probably, or Frankel, or who's the other guy?
Maslow.
Maslow, thank you. Yes, psychology. I would qualify this in two ways. The philosophy should be a philosophy for living on earth. That was Rand's phrase, for living well as a rational being, treating oneself and others insofar as possible as an end in themselves and not merely a means to someone else's ends. And secondly, it should be a biologically based psychology that's keyed to human needs and faculties, human psychological needs and faculties, aimed at actualizing oneself and achieving happiness. Now, our book had some specific tips and guidance. That's mostly thanks to Vinay's diligent work in Chapter 5, but also Chapter 6. But it really pointed to a follow-up self-help book that would more specifically give the kind of personal and social advice that Ed was offering in regard to entrepreneurial flourishing or commercial success. We haven't yet decided whether it's going to be another joint project, but we agree that there is a need for such a book. That's all I'll say.
Thank you, Roger. I second that. I think theory does belong to both psychology and philosophy. And the problem we encounter is the psychologists who have come up with a lot of useful empirical data don't theorize from the data enough, and they certainly don't look at other aspects of philosophy. And sometimes philosophers theorize like armchair philosophers, and they don't look at the empirical data. So there needs to be a fusion there. I frankly feel, a year of philosophy should be compulsory for those doing a psychology degree and vice versa. But I really loved what Ed said. As a practical matter, it should be taught in schools at a fairly young age, because that's the time you can really set your path. And then even the parents might realize, oh, well, wait a minute, I should have done this course 30 years ago. I didn't, but, I'm enjoying this homework now. Over to you, Winton.
Okay, well, I just had two thoughts on this. One, I had a look at the Library of Congress classification, and of course it doesn't support the study of human flourishing as an integrated body of thought. Maybe it should, or maybe we need library classifications that do that. And the other thought I had was that if you have a faculty of humanities and social sciences in the university, perhaps that could be renamed the Faculty of Human Flourishing, which would put a focus at least on what they're meant to be all about. That's my two bobs worth.
Thank you. Well, really loved all the end answers. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you all.
And to the readers and the viewers, we ask that you tune in to become savvy and keep tuning in to stay savvy. That's all for tonight. Good night and good luck.